Hey guys, and welcome to episode 199 of the OCDstories.com podcast. Now in this episode I chat with Jayme Valdez. Jayme is a therapist who's previously been on this show, and I'll link in the show notes to the episode so you can check it out. She is a licensed mental health counsellor, and I got her on the episode to specifically talk about paedophilia themed OCD. Now this is a theme that doesn't get talked about much, and maybe that's due to the stigma around the topic itself, but I thought it was important to cover because as we know, it's the content OCD uses to torture or keep someone trapped, and the content isn't necessarily important, but it feels very important to the person going through it, and hopefully this episode goes some way into helping you feel understood if this is a theme that is particularly bothersome for you, and hopefully helps you understand the treatment for it, and then hopefully you can find an OCD specialist to work through this theme with them. And in it, Jayme talks about what is paedophilia themed OCD. She talks about the common obsessions and compulsions that go along with this theme. What does exposure and response prevention look like for this theme? She gives examples to sort of bring it to life. We talk about the stigma and shame potentially that surrounds this theme of OCD. Then we talk about how families can help those loved ones that are affected by OCD, but also this particular theme. And then Jayme gives her words of hope and much, much more. So I hope this episode helps you and raises light on this particular theme. So without further ado, here is Jayme. On the podcast today, I have Jayme Valdez. Jayme is the owner of Clearview OCD Counselling, a private psychotherapy practice just outside of Boston. Jayme is a licensed mental health counsellor and serves on the board of directors for OCD Massachusetts and OCD Rhode Island. Welcome to the show, Jayme. Or back, I should say.
Thanks for having me back. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about a particular theme today. Before we reveal that, I guess people know based on the episode title already, but we got your therapy story and mental health story in the first episode we did, but just whether there's anything you want to share since we last talked, whether that's about your practice or your own journey or therapy.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one thing that I would share is that my practice is expanding, and that's it's an interesting experience for me to start taking on interns and licensed clinicians and see kind of where their own comfortability lies with working with different kinds of OCD, that they might be, really comfortable working with contamination, but then you bring up something else like postpartum OCD, or the secret topic that you and I are going to discuss in today's episode, which is pedophile OCD, and that there, even amongst trained clinicians, can be some real hesitance about wanting to kind of tap a toe into that water and really work with that material. So my hope for today's episode is that we can destigmatize some of the material around POCD, pedophile OCD, and other taboo subjects, and not only help clients or persons who are living with OCD, but also encourage clinicians to work with these more taboo subjects and really kind of get into the weeds. That's what I'm doing with my own practice, is really trying to encourage the people that I'm working with to get into some darker subjects, because the brain goes to some really weird, dark places.
Absolutely. Well, let's get into it. What is pedophile themed OCD?
So it is a subtype of OCD, and there's many subtypes: contamination OCD, relationship OCD, postpartum, symmetry. So it's one type of OCD, essentially. And it involves thoughts, images, commands, like thought commands of an unwanted sexual nature about sexual acts with children. It also, if we're kind of being more broad, might involve unwanted thoughts, images, or commands about sexual acts with pets or family members. Like there's a lot of kind of different layers to this, which might involve like incest OCD or doing something untoward with the family dog. In general, it's involving thoughts about children. And these thoughts are not wanted, they're not desired, and they feel really distressing to the person who's experiencing them. And there's an intense fear that somebody might lose control and then act on the thoughts. There also might be body sensations that accompany this. In the OCD world, we might call that a groinal response, where somebody experiences a sensation in their groinal area. But it also might include other parts of arousal, like in other parts of the body. And typically these are arising out of anxiety or fear. So essentially, pedophile OCD is the fear that you might lose control or have already lost control and harmed a child, or will harm a child in a sexual way.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you for explaining. And what are some of the common, well, you explained some of the common worries and obsessions there, but if there's more, and also what are the compulsions that people will often do to calm those obsessions?
So I talked about this a little bit in our prior interview, but the primary compulsion is avoidance. It's that people stop interacting with the children in their life. So if it's a parent, they stop bathing their child, changing their diapers. If they don't have children directly in their life, perhaps they're like at their nephew's birthday party, but they're staying physically very far away from all the children at the birthday party. They're avoiding going places that have children. They're avoiding watching movies or TV shows that might have themes related to children. They might not read material that has to do with children. They also so avoidance is one piece, but then they also might over engage in things like compulsive internet research, like, am I a pedophile? Like, exactly what makes somebody a pedophile? They might take internet quizzes. They might ask other people for reassurance about, so did I do that at the party? Like, was I standing really close to Joey or was I not? And a lot of what I see is people keeping kind of safety people near them. So it might be a dad who works from home, but he has his father, the grandfather of his children, come and be in the home the entire time to make sure that he doesn't do anything bad while he's alone with the children. So there's often this kind of compulsive safety person who's present. So there's a combination of avoidance and then over engaging in checking behaviors.
Yeah. No, cool. Thank you. And is there like a common trend or pattern you see in the occupations of these people that have this particular theme of OCD?
I can only speak from like my personal experience, but the majority of the clients that I work with who have POCD are adult males, which is not to say that women can't have it. I have certainly worked with females who have POCD as well, and it might also be something about underreporting, that women may be less likely to report these thoughts than men might when they come to a therapist. In general, the people that I work with tend to have children very present in their lives in one way or another. So they're parents themselves, or they're an auntie who interacts a lot with her nieces and nephews throughout the week. It's a school teacher or a nurse, like, pediatric nurse. It's somebody who they're having a lot of interactions with children. And there's a flip side to that, which is they became a parent or went into this profession because they are very connected to children, but that's also why they have POCD as opposed to contamination OCD because they highly value their relationships with children.
Yeah, I think that's kind of why I asked it, because I notice, obviously this isn't always the case, but I notice, well, as with OCD seems to latch on whatever the person usually is high up their value chain. It seems to be like teachers and people that work with children, and like you said, parents who their children are their whole world. You know, they just absolutely love investing in their children, and it's kind of no wonder that OCD will latch on to that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So, when it comes to ERP, what are some of like the example exposures you would do around this particular theme?
So some traditional exposures would be to write imaginal scripts about what you're picturing is happening, or like that you fear maybe did happen. There is a lot of overlap with POCD and what we call false memory OCD, where you're not sure if you can really trust your memory system. Like, did that thing happen? Did it not? Did it happen the exact way that I think I'm recalling it? So as an example, when I was changing my daughter's diaper, I think I wiped her this way, but did I maybe wipe her too aggressively? Did I enjoy wiping her? So there's a lot of overlap with this kind of false memory. Did I black out and maybe do something horrible during the diaper change, and I just can't face it and I don't remember it? So part of what we do with POCD in terms of exposure is writing imaginal scripts about the memories, the false memories, the urges, the fantasies about what could happen if you lost control, and ending with the worst case scenario of, so you lost control and then you got arrested and you went to jail and your family disowned you and you were a horrible person. And this really hits on why POCD is such a tough type of OCD to treat, because if you think about pedophilia, it's taboo across all cultures. It's the worst of the worst. Even in like a prison system, if you were to have all the inmates together, if a pedophile comes in and is sentenced within the prison, they are going to be targeted as opposed to somebody who robbed a bank or murdered somebody. Like, this is the worst of the worst in terms of almost all societies. So it's an extremely taboo subject. So with the ERP, we really work on how taboo it is, looking directly at it. We might do some in vivo exposures where we have somebody rate the attractiveness of children, or like start looking at the materials that they've been avoiding. So if they won't read children's books to their children at bedtime, or they won't do bath time, they won't be alone with their children and just take them to the park, then we start getting them to re-engage in the things that they've been avoiding.
Okay. Yeah. And then also kind of them reframing from whatever the compulsions they do. So yeah. So then for example, if they're checking online constantly, to then say, A, we're not going to check in this session, but also when you leave today, don't go and do that compulsion, that check, or whatever it is.
Absolutely. And then providing the education for the client about how the checking only reinforces that this is something to worry about and it's something that needs to be addressed. And so I need to go online and look up 10 different quizzes. Every time you do that, it sends a message to the brain that says, this is a really important problem that we have to look at. Whereas if you set it aside in some way, and you go about the business of your evening, at some point the brain catches on that this is a false alarm and it popped into the head, but we're setting it over here, and then we're going about the business of the evening.
Yeah, good. Okay, and are there any particular client examples or case examples that you can share that you think would help illustrate it?
Yeah, so There's a million because this is like this is what I love to work with in kind of a weird way. I love to work with POCD because I think that it's a type of OCD that many clinicians are a little wary to work with. And so I really want to open my doors and say, I'm here to talk very explicitly with you and very openly with you about these thoughts in your head and these body sensations you get and these urges and things like that. So probably 60 to 75% of my caseload is people living with POCD as their primary OCD subtype. So I have one client I'm thinking of who has done tremendous work. I've been working with him maybe 9 months at this point. But he was formerly labeled as treatment non-compliant, that he wasn't doing the treatment right, he wasn't getting better, and it was his fault, essentially. And he was working with an OCD specialist. And I was really sad when he came to me and told me that that was the label that he had received, because to me, treatment non-compliant means it's nothing about the client, it's that the treatment is not working. So he and I have worked for some months together on his POCD, and there's, as I'm sure you can imagine, a lot of overlap with other subtypes like relationship OCD. Like, what is it like when I'm being intimate with my wife and then I get an intrusive image of my daughter? We see a lot of this with POCD, and I don't think people talk about how much it impacts someone's intimate life with their partner. And maybe we can touch on that later. But anyway, he was going on a family camping excursion with his son and daughter and his wife. And he was really proud of the progress he had made. And then he also got a sleeping bag to make sure, because he was going to be in the tent next to his son. And he purposefully bought a sleeping bag to make sure that he could literally kind of insulate himself, his arms and legs and everything else inside this sleeping bag. And we ended up joking that it was like a POCD condom, that he was like wrapping himself in this to make sure that he didn't do anything at 3 o'clock in the morning. And so his exposure activity was to not bring this newly purchased sleeping bag on the camping trip, and to just sleep in the tent with his son and see what happened.
And what happened, if you can share?
He was a good father. He had a good camping trip. He had some tough moments. He also did the homework, and I was really proud of him. And he's at a point now in his treatment where he's very much scaling back and is doing really well. He still gets intrusions, but he's not providing these safety measures, like making sure that he's wrapping himself up to make sure that he doesn't do anything bad in the middle of the night. This is also somebody who had his father in the house at all times to make sure that he wouldn't be bad with his children. And he's now able to be alone with the children, and asks his father to leave, and takes those risks. And to date, nothing's happened other than he's getting his life back.
Yeah, good for him.
Yeah.
No, that was a good example. Yeah, and I mean, the sleeping bag kind of just shows you the lengths that OCD can take people, and the attention to detail of like protecting oneself and others. Yeah. Okay. Is there any others that come to mind?
So I think the main thing that comes to mind is it's not a specific client story, but it's kind of the story that I hear from almost all clients with POCD, which is that they get a lot of body sensations associated with the intrusions. And I think that that's one thing that sets POCD apart a little bit than maybe some other subtypes. I mean, you might get a rush of adrenaline or racing heart with some other OCD subtypes, but I think there's some really specific body sensations that show up with POCD that then make people feel extremely alarmed. And this goes for men and for women. So not necessarily a specific client example, but helping someone sit with that feeling of a groinal response and just letting it be there. Or we might even go in the opposite direction and try to amplify it. Like, can you make that groinal worse? Can you make it more intense? Because usually when we try to go in the opposite direction and not try to calm things down, but make them worse, often the body gives up and says, well, I don't know how to do that. So some of the work with POCD involves interoceptive exposures where you're exposing the person to the body sensations that they're experiencing.
Yeah, and this the groinal. Chrissy Hodges talks a lot about that, and it goes across many sexual related OCD themes, right? So also with sexual orientation OCD, people can experience it there too. Yeah, okay, and is it that you have explained this, but like the where you might feel a twinge or something down there. And is that kind of happening anyway to most people? They're just not aware of it because they're not anxious, or is the anxiety making the twinge kind of appear? Does that make sense?
I mean, I could have the wrong answer on this, to be honest, but my guess is that when we're so hyper focused on a particular part of the body, like if I was to really focus on my left toe for the next 20 minutes, like really focus on it, at some point I would start to feel something in my left toe, like an itch or a heat or just something about my left toe that feels very different than the way it felt 20 minutes ago. So I think when people, especially when there's anxiety involved, anxiety is a revving up of the systems. It's the heart is beating faster. It's pumping the blood. It's, saying all systems go. And that's honestly very compatible with a sexual arousal response. It's all systems go. We are biologically primed to make these systems be active. And so anxiety is very directly linked, I think, to sexual arousal. And they have done studies on this, not to reassure people too much, but that people with POCD or anyone with any thoughts of a taboo sexual nature, that sexual arousal is no indicator of intent. It's just an indicator that something in your body got aroused and was set off.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The hyper arousal of hyper awareness of the body. The idea of flying came to mind for me. So when you're driving down a road, the car is actually, most cars are really bumpy, but you're not acknowledging the bumps because you're not anxious while you're driving. At least most people aren't. But then for a lot of people, when they're flying, a slight bump while flying because they're anxious almost feels like the end of the world, when in reality it's no more bumpy than what you'd experience day to day in your car. But because that anxiety is there, it goes from being something you don't pay attention to something that's end of the world. Absolutely. It's a really good example. Okay. No, thank you for that. And a question I put here was, because there is a lot of stigma around this particular theme, because as you said, the pedophilia is one of the most taboo topics in arguably any culture. So I have read from time to time in forums that people have refused to do ERP or been hesitant to do it because what if I do these exposures and it gets rid of the anxiety, and then actually I realize that I am this thing, whether it's a pedophile, whether it's a serial killer, whether it's, I don't know, I'm running out of themes here, but there's obviously a million, or whether it is, I have some health problem. So what if they fear doing exposures, could prove their fears to be true. How would you kind of get around that with someone?
So for me, I almost like, I mean, I'm an artist, so I view things very visually in my head, but I almost view it almost like a Monopoly board or like some other game board where I see people in my head at a certain juncture in treatment. And there is literally a point in treatment where people with POCD and other subtypes of OCD say, what if I am that thing though? And that is part of their journey. That's part of their treatment. It's not a detriment to it. I have like this art piece that I'm personally working on with the DSM definition of OCD, where there's an extra little bullet point that says, but what if I don't have OCD? That's literally part of the diagnosis is, you know, but what if I don't have this? Or what if I'm actually a pedophile? So that's part of the treatment is getting to that point. And typically with my clients, that happens a few months in that they start to get relief from their really debilitating symptoms. And it also might be that the medication's starting to help if they're on medication, but they're starting to kind of get some clarity and breathing room. And then they think, wait a minute, what if the intrusions were what was keeping me safe? And so there's not like a magic solution to how to handle this, but essentially it's the big shrug. It's the, I don't know, maybe you are a pedophile, maybe you're not. And this is where my clients love and hate me at the same time, but I can't provide reassurance around that. You need to engage in valued behavior and then see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. Okay, thank you for that. And whenever I do these theme-specific episodes, I always ask this question, which is exposure and response prevention therapy, or ERP, as effective for this theme as it is for any other theme, such as contamination or harm or sexual orientation, OCD?
I do believe that it's as effective. I believe very strongly in exposure therapy with response prevention. So it's not just exposing the person to the thing that they're afraid of, it's preventing their urge to calm themselves down or prevent a bad outcome. It's not enough to just drive over the bridge and, be afraid the entire time you're driving over it and say 7 Hail Marys. Like, you have to drive over the bridge and be open to the bridge might cave under me as I'm doing it. And I'm still going to drive over the bridge because that's how I get to work each day. And so that's my valued behavior. But what I would say about POCD and exposure is that I think clinicians need to be very, very careful with the exposure materials. I have some really devastating stories in my client files about times when the ERP materials, like for instance, a journal of imaginal exposure scripts or a recording of scripts or images that were used of looking at children were then used in divorce proceedings, to try to gain child custody in some way, or were then reported to authorities. And there isn't a very good understanding by the general public or even really within the OCD world about what POCD is. And so with my clients, I'm very, very cautious about the ERP materials. I think it's very different to write an imaginal script about pedophilia than it is to be working with, pretend dog poop, for instance. And so I would really encourage clinicians to use a lot of thought and care about how to safeguard those materials and how to assign homework. But to answer your question, I think the exposures are relatively the same. You expose and then you don't compulse.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it's a good point you raised just now. And I think someone told me in one of the other episodes that at least in iPhone, I'm sure you can do this on Android device as well, but in iPhone, you can now password protect your notes section.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be a good way of doing scripting, is writing them in there and having them password protected so that only you can access them, and they're not written on a bit of piece of paper that you could lose and someone could read and not have any context of why you've written this.
Absolutely. And then there's also the PE app, which is for prolonged exposure, which is a related technique developed by Edna Foa for trauma recovery. But there's an app, the PE app, and you can do a password protected audio recording. So if you were wanting to listen to your imaginal exposure scripts, it doesn't have to be about trauma. It can be about POCD or any subtype of OCD, but then you can password protect it and listen to that, as you're driving to work or, whatever the homework is. But I think just being really sensitive and cautious about like what the actual exposure materials are and making sure that they're ethically provided and that clients are advised of how to use those in a way that is going to help them and not in any way come back to haunt them. Yeah,
good points. And I think I mentioned this, but I said about there's potentially a lot of shame around this particular theme because of the taboo nature of what it can be. So how do you work with that aspect within treatment of working through some of the shame that they would have experienced as a result of this theme?
So if there's one thing that I could say, like if there's any clinicians out there listening, it's to ask in the intake. So when you're doing an intake with a client, they are going to likely be presenting to you saying that I'm struggling with having to step certain ways on the sidewalk, or I'm preoccupied with thoughts about my boyfriend, or, they're coming to you with some other kinds of OCD. And I felt awful about it, but there was one client where it took almost a year before she came out that she was experiencing POCD, and we had been working the entire year on her other OCD subtypes. But even though she knew that this was one of my subspecialties, she still wasn't able to talk about it until a year into treatment. So I encourage clinicians who specialize in OCD and related disorders to ask in the intake, are you experiencing thoughts about religion? Are you experiencing thoughts about people in your life? Are you experiencing thoughts about cleanliness or being a neatnik? Like to go over all the OCD subtypes and just ask them almost like a checklist in the intake. And as part of that, say, are you experiencing thoughts that are unwanted about children or of a sexual nature or that feel yucky or taboo? Because it gives the client then an invitation to say, oh, yeah, I didn't even know that you knew that that was a thing that could possibly be going on in my head. Clients still might not disclose at that point because it's, again, so shameful. It feels so awful. But it at least provides the opportunity in the forum.
Yeah, good point. Okay, and you mentioned about potentially how this theme can affect relationships within families earlier. But how can families support their loved ones with this particular theme?
So it's going to be similar to supporting all other subtypes of OCD. It's going to be that the family members provide a lot of empathy and reflective listening. So, honey, I'm so sorry that you're struggling with this thought right now. I see how much that's really plaguing you. I wish that there was something I could do. I love the I wish statements because you're valuing and honoring what somebody's experiencing while also not fixing it. So you're saying, I hear you and I wish that I could take this all away for you. I can't. And so then like part one is empathy, reflective listening, I wish statements. Part two is bounce the ball back into their court. what do you think your OCD specialist would say to do about this? Or what do you think is a valued behavior that you could engage in this moment? So you're bouncing the ball back to them and asking them to do the problem solving, and you're not fixing it for them. I think the other thing that family members can be really vigilant about if they're living with somebody with POCD is not compulsing on that person's behalf. So if the person doesn't want to be left alone with the children or won't do any of the diaper changes or bath time, you might start slow. You might say, I would love it if you could just come sit in the bathroom while I give the kids a bath. And you just sit there with me. I'll still do the bath. And then maybe 2 weeks from now, we'll be at the point where you could start helping me bathe the kids. But that family members stop compulsing on their partner's behalf.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Cool, thank you. And what words of hope would you give someone who is experiencing this theme?
I'm not sure if this is a message of hope, but I would like to say that I think that this theme is, from my experience, more prevalent than other OCD subtypes. And maybe that's just what I'm seeing because I put it out there that I'm happy to work with this theme and I can help you with this. But even people that I've been working with on their other OCD subtypes, many of them at some point, this is a theme that has come into their heads. So what I would want to say is that you're not alone with this theme at all, that there's a lot of people out there who are experiencing this. And I would also say that there are providers who are very comfortable discussing all the nitty-gritty details and the ins and outs of it, and that I would encourage you to find a provider who is able to do that with you. And if they're not, encourage them to learn more, because this is definitely an OCD subtype that many people experience that deserves treatment and can very much be helped.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so slight change of direction now, and I have asked you these, but I'm going to do it again. Pick up the phone and call your 20-year-old self. What would you tell her?
Oh, goodness. Is this going to be different? I have to think for a minute. Is it going to be what I would have told her the last time you and I spoke? Yeah, I think my answer is the same. Hang in there, keep learning. Life is really interesting. It's not always pleasant. Sometimes it's amazing and spectacular, and sometimes it's not. And so stop trying to make life happen a certain way. Just be a passenger on the ship and see where that life is going.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you've got a billboard. What do you want written on that billboard?
Same thing as last time. That I know, is that I really want that billboard to say that you are a competent, capable, resilient human being. I know I said it last time, but I deeply believe in that. It's not you're a happy person. It's not you're a peaceful person. It's that you can pick yourself up and you can do this. You can do really, really difficult things. So the billboard says, you are a competent, capable, resilient human being.
Yeah, love it. And is there anything else on this topic or anything else that I haven't asked you that you wish you could have shared today?
I guess on this topic and related to all types of OCD would be to maybe view the OCD commands in your head as more of like an overprotective friend than an enemy. So it's somebody who's trying really hard to make sure that you don't do something bad on the camping trip with your son. And it's coming up with all these creative solutions. Like, you need to go buy a sleeping bag and here's how you zip yourself into it. And here's, you need to keep the tent door open so that you can yell out for your wife if you start doing something horrible. but it's an anxious, overprotective friend, and it's misfiring. And at some point, you have to kind of look at this friend and say, "Thanks for looking out for me. Those are some good warning messages. I appreciate it. But also, you seem to be a little anxious over there, and it doesn't always pan out that way for me. And actually, most of the time, it doesn't. Like I to date haven't actually harmed a child. So I appreciate this overprotective friend in my head, trying to keep me and the people around me safe. But at some point, I also have to say, can you just step aside for a minute? And I'm going to go on my camping trip and go take some risks." So I hope that people can view OCD in that way, as opposed to like this thing that they have to fight against, or it's like an enemy in their head that they have to purge their thoughts of. It's more like somebody that you can kind of work with and be like, "Yeah, I hear what you're saying. You're worried about this thing happening, and I'm going to disregard you in this moment."
Yeah, I love it. And that's a useful way of looking at it. So thank you for discussing this topic. It's a topic that doesn't get talked about. So hopefully we've shed some good light on it and people find it useful.
Thanks for having me on again. Maybe next time we'll pick another taboo subject to talk about.
Absolutely. So there you have it. Thank you to Jayme for giving her time to go into depth on this particular theme of OCD. And thank you to you guys for listening. And quick disclaimer, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. Until we speak, take care.